Good evening, everyone. My name is Omine Abu, and I work for the City of Glendale Water Services Department. Joining me tonight is Joanne Toms, who also works for the City of Glendale Water Services Department, and Andrew Peroni. I would like to welcome everyone. The topic for tonight's class is on desert hardy and resilient landscapes. Before diving in, let's go over some webinar logistics. Attendees are muted and the class will be recorded. The recording will be available on the city's water conservation website and YouTube channel in about a week. You can type your questions and comments in the Q&A or use the chat functions, and Joanne and I will read and respond to as many as we can throughout the webinar. There will also be breaks throughout the presentation to answer questions, so just keep that in mind as well. The class is scheduled to be 1.5 hours long. We have about 1 hour allotted for the presentation and about 30 minutes for questions. We will aim to stay on track as we want to be respectful of your time. If you experience any significant technical difficulties, please contact Joanne Toms via email or phone. Her email is jtoms@glendaleaz.com, or you can call her at 623-930-3596. After this presentation, we'll follow up with an email that includes a copy of the PowerPoint, resources, recording, and a link to the survey. And if you complete the survey, you'll be entered for a chance to win a free gift card from a local nursery. So be sure to fill out that survey. We definitely want to hear your feedback, and it really helps us improve future programs. So let's go over some Zoom attendee features. So here is what your current view might resemble. You can play around with the features so you're comfortable. You can click and drag the vertical bar located in between the presenter and the presentation to enlarge or shrink the presentation view. You can also adjust the audio settings in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen if you'd like. And feel free, again, to send any comments using the chat button or share your questions using the Q&A button. Joanne and I will do our best to answer any questions, and then we'll definitely have time at the end of the presentation to do questions as well. I would like to highlight a few free publications that Andrew will be referring to for tonight's presentation. Direct links to these resources was included in the class reminder email. The first is Landscape Plants for the Arizona Desert. It's a publication that has more than 200 low maintenance, water thrifty, and beautiful plants that thrive in Arizona. We also have this lovely guide called Landscaping with Style, which is a step-by-step guide about design, installation, and care of your new low maintenance landscape. And lastly, we have a landscape watering by the numbers, which is a tool to determine how much water your plants need to ensure they're healthy and beautiful. You can access these guides and other publications online using the links on the slide, or Glendale residents can request to have a hard copy mailed by filling out the request form, or you can email greenliving@glendaleaz.com, or you can call 623-930-3553. And if you don't live in the city of Glendale, be sure to check with your local water provider, and they might be able to mail you some copies as well. But you can access all these resources online. I also have some exciting news to share. So this fall, we'll be renovating a section of our Xeriscape demonstration garden to include a succulent garden. And so for those who might be joining us for the first time, our demonstration garden surrounds the Glendale Main Library. The renovation will take place just to the east of the library's north entrance, and we are looking for volunteers to help plant succulents. And if you're interested in volunteering or know someone that might be interested, please contact Ann Staley, and her email is astaley, STAHLEY, @glendaleaz.com. And I am very excited to introduce to you our presenter tonight. So Andrew has worked in irrigation, landscape, and water efficiency for the last 10 years and is currently the City of Goodyear's Water Conservation Coordinator, helping residents and businesses save water inside and outside. So everyone, help me give a virtual round of applause to help me welcome Andrew Peroni. Thank you so much, Andrew, for being here tonight.
Thank you, Oni. Thank you for having me. All right, are you ready for me to go ahead and share screen?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, it says you have to stop sharing first, I guess.
Here we go.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about desert hardy and resilient landscapes. So thank you for the wonderful introduction. Thank you everybody for being here today. So why are we talking about this topic? Why is it important besides just we want to have a nice yard and we want it to be pretty tough? Well, from a water conservation perspective and a water provider perspective, and just you've probably been hearing about in the news quite a bit, that water is a very precious resource, but there's also issues with it, specifically on Lake Mead. And so it's very important for us to be as smart with the water that we do have. And a huge piece of that is by being efficient with the water that we put on our landscapes. So many of the cities throughout the Phoenix Valley have a good chunk of water use that goes to landscape watering. So the big question is, well, how much do we need to put out there so that we can keep good looking landscapes? We don't want to have no plants. So the goal is to help our landscapes to be as resilient and as hardy as possible to help us through times like these. So here are the things we're going to be talking about today, some of the elements of a resilient or hardy desert landscape. Number one, desert adapted plants. Obviously, that's a big, huge piece of it. Watering practices. So we won't be able to go into a ton of detail on all the specifics of watering, but we will get into it. Maintenance practices. Grading, as in your soil and how your yard, where water flows in your yard. And then sharing your successes with your landscapes. So we're going to go ahead and start with desert adapted plants. So as Omni mentioned, this is the book that is a really handy resource, especially if you are looking at planting a new area of your yard or replacing some plants that have not made it. And we'll talk about specifically last year, how several plants did not make it through the heat of last year. So then it's a question of what are we going to put back in that spot? So I'd encourage you, if you haven't already picked up either a hard copy or logged onto that digital resource, to check this out. It's going to be a very useful and handy resource when you're searching for plants. So plant selection is a huge piece of having a resilient landscape. So a couple things you'll notice about desert adapted plants, whether they're in that book or they are, you find them at the nursery or online, is that they're going to have certain characteristics. So a lot of those characteristics are going to be, for instance, in this one, you're going to have some leaves that are going to be tend to be on the smaller side. They're going to maybe be kind of either rubbery or leathery. They might even have some visible kind of hair on them. And a lot of the plants that are desert adapted or hardy and can handle the weather that we have and some water stress are going to be plants that have these characteristics. And the main reason is going to be because they're trying to minimize water loss. Similarly, you'll notice cacti and succulents are going to have a kind of specific look and feel to them. You might notice some spines and some maybe some of that squishy leaves. That's going to be related to the water holding. So these plants, the succulents specifically, and cacti are going to be holding more moisture within their leaves, and then they protect themselves with those spines. So your plant selection is going to have plants that are going to have a lot of these characteristics. Now, not all of them have that. There are several plants out there that might be surprised at how well they do in our area, even though they might look like a little bit more, but you could say full or leafy. So one thing to keep in mind about a hardy landscape, there's two ways you can approach. I mean, there's really several ways, but there's two ways on the plant side. You can stick to only native plants, and that's good if you're trying to attract some wildlife. But there are also a lot of plants that you'll find in that book that are not necessarily native, but we call them desert adapted. And that's why you hear that term used so much, because they're not native, but they're also not harmful to our environment. They do well here. They're very tough. So it really depends on the goals of your landscape and what you're trying to do with it. So there's some very good low maintenance ones on there that aren't necessarily native. So just keep that in mind when you're shopping for plants and looking around, that if you are looking specifically for native, to kind of keep that in mind and look for it. So some other things that you'll notice on some of these plants, you see some thorns maybe on the actual stems themselves. Again, look at the patterns here, very small leaves, but they're also, they could still have some really nice green color. You might notice it could be a little silvery sometimes, but the benefit of that is, as we'll talk about, you can really have a very diverse and beautiful looking landscape by utilizing all these different types of plants and their textures and their colors. So we can see here we got a velvet mesquite, a cascalote, and catclaw acacia. So they all look kind of similar in their leaves, but they're going to look different in how they grow, and then how large they get, etc. Another nice thing about picking certain types of plants is depending on what kind of shade you would like as well. There are lots of desert adapted landscape, or a very tough landscape doesn't have to be full sun, high exposure. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. You can have some shade, as we'll see as well. So talking specifically about design, we referenced this book earlier on as well. The Landscaping with Style. This is a really helpful resource for if you're kind of starting from scratch from a certain area, but even if you're just trying to figure out, okay, what's the best play, especially if you had issues with planting plants in an area and they don't seem to make it. When you're like, I don't know what I've done or what I need to do, check out this resource, because there might be some tips in there of how to plant the plants and how to get them started properly, especially for desert landscapes that might help you have some success in some troublesome areas. So a couple of things, I won't go deep into that book in terms of every step of how to design a desert, a hardy desert landscape, because we want to talk about all those different points, especially if you already have a landscape that's designed. But a couple of points that I'll make here is you can have a very highly interesting landscape by utilizing a couple of key components on the design side. And one of them here that we're looking at is some different textures. So we can see that there is some general interest in the plants themselves, but also in the way that they're planted. There's very little area that's planted. These are going to be very low water, almost no maintenance. And yet it's a highly kind of interesting way to design this corner by the different textures and the hardscape that's used. So one thing that we often recommend if you're having issues with certain plants in certain areas is to try them in pots. And pots can also be a very useful way to reduce some water use, because it's going to be a much smaller soil area you're trying to water. And then also it can help you to grow some plants that you might not otherwise be able to keep alive in the ground. So an interesting thing there. And then another kind of similar with using some textures. So you can see they're all succulents. And then you got some, looks like maybe a sago palm back there in the background. Very tough landscapes. They all need about the same amount of water in this whole section here, all these plants. But you can see it's just all sorts of different textures going on. It's a very highly interesting. And a lot of our homes and residential areas, we have these kind of blank walls, right? Maybe they have a color of stuck or something, a veneer on it, but maybe not. Maybe it's just the bricks, and it's maybe a tan or beige or something like that. So what do you do with that? This is one way to kind of really draw some interest to an area that might not otherwise be interesting and still have a really tough landscape. So this slide is more to highlight, similarly on the design side, just to take a look at the various colors that we have. So living in the desert, we have an abundance of color that is available to us. The reason why you may not see these colors all the time, some of these plants may be very common plants that you actually are seeing out there all the time and may not know it. And the reason is because they might be trimmed too much. And we'll talk about maintenance. So an important thing about if you want to have a landscape that has some color, you got to give your plants some room to grow and let them bloom. And usually that's actually helpful for a really resilient or low maintenance landscape, because it just means you have to go out there even less to do stuff to your plants, because you got to let them do their thing and then have their blooms. So that one on the top left is a very common one that we have out here, the Texas Ranger, but we hardly ever see them in that full of a bloom unless you know somebody who kind of lets the plant do its thing. A lot of times they're trimmed pretty heavily. So in the bottom right, we can see some of that texture and color together, some groupings of plants. So these are all very tough landscapes here that are not going to require very much water at all to keep going. I like referencing this. This is from the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. You can find this publication online, or you can request some more information from our Maricopa County Master Gardeners. They're a great resource. But I'm not going to go into all the little details of this, but the main thing I want to highlight is that throughout the year, you can have color in your yard. So these are all going to be desert adapted, really tough plants, oftentimes maybe even native, but you can really go through and pick out and say, okay, what is it that I really want? I want something that has low water and is going to be blooming, and I want to have something blooming in my yard most of the year. And so this is a really helpful resource, and similar ones out there like it, where you can find plants and then have them throughout your yard, so that something's always kind of in bloom and has some interest, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a high maintenance landscape. One thing that I like to make a point about, if you're going to have a really tough or desert hardy landscape, then you want to avoid these marginal species. And what I mean by that are species that they might have grown well here maybe in the past, or they can grow well here if they have the right conditions, just the right conditions, and maybe a good amount of extra water. So those ones on the left are queen palms, and you probably have noticed if you've been around the valley the last couple of years that most people's queen palms did not make it through 2020, not because they got a virus, but because it was so hot. They really could not handle the heat that we had. It was outside of their range, almost like, think of it on the other side of cold, like certain plants can't handle too cold of a weather. For those queen palms, it just was too hot. I saw some that were literally sitting in water and it didn't matter. The person was watering them, doing everything they could, and they still died. And it's just because it was outside of its range. So that's a marginal species. These pine trees, which there's still some that have made it, but if you're trying to have the pine tree on the right in a really hardy desert adapted landscape, and you're just planting it, you're deciding to try and plant one because it has, gets large and has a lot of shade, it's not typically going to, it's going to struggle. We have a lot really dry weather, and the pines prefer, a really deep soak, so they require typically more water. And so it's going to be one that's going to be a lot harder to keep alive, a lot more maintenance. And so just keep that in mind. Other plants that you see that are common, that are kind of marginal, are going to be like your hibiscus plants, roses especially. Certain ones that you can, it's, well, we know we can keep them alive, but it's not going to be a plant that you're going to find in a very resilient landscape. If we have a time where we're trying to save some extra water, or we have some extremes in weather, then these are the types of plants that are going to die first. So if you're trying to avoid that situation, then I would stay away from those types of plants. And a word of caution, if you often shop at some of the big box stores like a Lowe's or Home Depot, it's going to be harder to, you're going to see more of these plants that are marginal. And the reason is because they have, national contracts with growers, and they get plants from one or two sources through the whole country. And for the most part, the plants kind of make it for a lot of areas, but in our area, you're going to have a lot lower success rate just grabbing something that looks nice and planting it. So you really want to do some homework on the plants, and especially if you're like, oh, I've never seen this one in anybody else's yard, might be a good reason for that, because it might not have made it. So keep that in mind with our marginal species. What about lawns? Didn't think I was going to talk about lawns, huh? Well, lawns, can they be a piece of a desert hardy or resilient landscape? Well, in fact, if you have a Bermuda grass lawn, which is a warm season lawn, then they still can be a part of a resilient landscape. Well, how is that possible? We know that they take water. They're going to take more water than a desert landscape. However, something to keep in mind about your warm season Bermuda grass, which is the one that's growing right now. And if you're not familiar, in Arizona, if you have a lawn and you see it's green all year, what that means is some point in mid-fall, they had to put an extra seed down for winter grass, and then water that in and get it to grow. And that grows through the winter, and then it will die in the spring. And then the Bermuda grass, which is always present underneath, will come back in the spring. Otherwise, what happens is, you'll see the picture on the right here is what happens. That's not a dead lawn, that's just dormant. So this is what it would look like in the wintertime if you just left it as is, and it'll come right back in the spring. So how can you have a lawn and have a resilient landscape, especially if you already have one and you're like, oh, it's so much work, I don't want to take it out. And it is a lot of work to take out lawn. So you might decide to keep it, especially if you're using it. You have kids and pets maybe using it, or you host and it's nice. So some ways, strategies for that to keep it resilient: proper watering. So proper watering, you probably hear that from the Glendale Conservation Office all the time. We say it all the time. Proper watering promotes deep roots, and the deep roots are going to make that lawn very resilient. One example I like to use is sometimes you'll notice in some old farm flood irrigated properties that they seem to have the greenest lawn out of anybody, and yet they only get that flood irrigation once every 2 weeks. So how is that possible? They're only watering the lawn once every 2 weeks. Well, because those roots are going down 8, 12, 14, 16 inches on that grass. So it's a little bit different grass than we use in the lawn, in our home lawns, but it's, the point is that it's a very tough grass. It needs a really deep watering, and then you can kind of give it some time in between, and you're going to be surprised at how tough Bermuda grass is. One way to really keep your lawn resilient and hardy, especially in times when there's some water stress, is not to overseed it with winter grass, for 2 reasons. So one reason is pretty obvious, the water savings. But the second reason would be that it actually puts a lot of stress on your Bermuda grass when the winter grass is on top of it, because now it's using the nutrients in the soil, and it's adding water into the soil at a time of year where that Bermuda grass doesn't really want to stay wet. And so it's causing extra stress on the Bermuda grass. So that's why you'll sometimes see, if you've had a lawn and you typically overseed every single winter, you might have noticed over the years that your Bermuda grass, your summer grass, is coming back kind of weaker each time, and it's more patchy and it's not as nice and lush. And then by the time you finally get it really nice right around September, then you're cutting it back down and ready for the winter grass. So that puts a lot of stress on the summer grass, and it doesn't help promote a resilient landscape. So one recommendation would be to not overseed and just let it go dormant. And if we have a really kind of warm winter, then a lot of times you'll notice that grass will stay green almost to Thanksgiving. And it might green up as soon as Valentine's Day, especially on those smaller areas of lawn. If you have a kind of a smaller patch of Bermuda grass and it has some hardscape around it, it'll stay greener longer. And the reason is because the soil stays warmer longer. And so that grass can continue to grow when it has that hardscape kind of heating up the soil. So something to keep in mind. And then a key piece, which might be on a lot of people's minds right now, say, okay, what happens if we have some more intense water restrictions or cutbacks? Well, Bermuda grass can go drought dormant. And you might have experienced this if you had a Bermuda grass and you decided, I'm just not going to water it for a while and let it die. And then as soon as we got some rain, it came all back. And that's because the Bermuda grass can go for a while, even in the summer, and just kind of sit there and wait for water. And that soil, even if it dries out, those roots are in there and they're just waiting. The benefit of this is if you want to have a lawn, even if we have a time where you say, okay, we really need to reduce how much water we're putting on our landscape, you can bring that lawn right back, maybe with a little bit of work, but not really nearly as much as you think, in order to have that grass again when the water may be available. So something to keep in mind. Another key thing is the maintenance. So dethatching and aeration are also really important to have a resilient lawn over the years. So just kind of keep an eye on that if you do have one or you're interested in one, to keep up on the maintenance part of it. Okay, before I move into watering, are there any questions?
Hey, Andrew. We did get a question that came through. Looks like Joanne just got to it as well, but Elena had asked, what's a good winter grass besides the rye they seem to use a lot of in Sun City?
That's a great question. Yeah, they've done a lot of research at University of Arizona on different winter grasses and which ones perform well here. And the reason you keep seeing ryegrass over and over again is because it's really kind of the best one to use here. And the reason is because it doesn't have the same kind of, well, one of the reasons is it doesn't have, it kind of fits within the season. So you don't want a grass that grows too well on the shoulder months, because now it competes with the Bermuda grass even more. So for instance, you might be familiar with like Kentucky bluegrass or fescue. Fescue you see more in California, and bluegrass you see more like in Colorado. And those grasses have a really longer season that they can tolerate weather. The problem with that here is that allows a shorter and shorter window for the Bermuda grass, our summer grass, which is really the only thing that's going to grow in the summer here. It gives it a smaller and smaller window for it to recover. And so they use the ryegrass because it doesn't create a lot of thatch over. It's easy when it kind of finally goes, it goes. It's easier to kind of transition back. And then it's easier to seed and get going in that way. Whereas like a fescue, I don't remember on the bluegrass, but the fescue for sure is more of a clumping grass. So it doesn't fill in as nicely as an overseed. So those are kind of some of the reasons why you see the ryegrass used again and again. It's not because it's the most water efficient. It's probably not. I think they did some water studies, and I think it might have been the bluegrass. I forgot which one specifically was actually more water efficient as a winter grass, but it doesn't play nice with the Bermuda summer grass. So if you had a situation, which is kind of rare here, but if you had a situation where you say we only want the winter grass, and then every summer if it dies, it doesn't matter. Then you could try and experiment with some of those other grasses. So it's a good question. I've even explored the idea a little bit with some of like, for instance, like schools. You say, well, schools really only need the fields when the school season, right? But with the way the school year is now, starting in August, the only grass that's going to be there is the Bermuda. So that's what they typically will have. Good question.
Thanks, Andrew. We have another question that just came in from Monica, and this might be like a whole different topic on its own. But she had asked, how do I effectively remove the Bermuda grass without using chemicals?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'd probably refer you to Omni and Joanne after. There are some resources out there. The chemical, I know we discussed this as a group, a lot of the cities just recently, about what are the other options out there, and we've been looking ourselves in order to give good recommendations to our residents. The chemical is going to be your fastest, most effective way, really, right now. There are other strategies, so I won't go too deep into that. Like you said, I mean, that could be a whole nother presentation. So I would encourage you just to reach out. I know Joanne and Omni have some good resources related to that. There are some other options. They're just a little bit more involved and a little bit more time consuming. So one thing to keep in mind, for instance, if you're in an HOA and you're talking about a front lawn, they may not be patient enough with you to do those other strategies. So you just have to kind of either work with them or keep that in mind. But if you're not in an HOA, then you might be willing to experiment with some of those other strategies.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, Monica will be in touch and we'll provide some resources, and then I'll include it in a follow-up email as well that I send out to the class. But that's all we have on questions for now. So I think we'll pause from there and we'll let you continue on with the presentation.
Thank you. Okay, talk about watering practices. Okay, so there's three key pieces that we're going to talk about in this section related to watering. Now, watering on its own could be a big, long other presentation, and there is one on Glendale's website, so I'd encourage you to go there. But we're going to talk about some of the basics related to resilient landscapes. Three key pieces. Your controller programming is going to be one. The in-ground hardware, which is actually your actual sprinkler heads, drip, the actual plastic that's under the ground, and then addressing leaks promptly. So why change the program in the first place? Why? I want a low maintenance yard. Why do I need to go out there and change the program? Well, in short, seasons is the reason why we need to change the program. The plants and your lawn, if you have one, they all need different amounts of water depending on the weather. And so every single day the weather is different, right? So the more frequently we can adjust our watering, the better it actually is for your plants, and typically the more water efficient it's going to be as well. So what are some of the things that affect water needs? Some of these are going to be obvious, but some of them may be not so much. So weather, so you have your season, the actual season of the year, summer, spring, winter, fall. Wind is actually a big impact. So higher wind, and especially a drier wind, is going to impact and increases plant need. Temperature is an obvious one to us. Humidity is also a big factor. So higher humidity means less plant need, which isn't always obvious to us because we don't feel any different, but the plants actually need less water. Your soil type, your condition. If you have a really compacted soil, that's going to impact water need versus soil that maybe has a little bit better infiltration. The plant type, which is a pretty obvious one. How big the plant is. More leaf area typically means a little bit higher water need. To an extent, you could have a really huge mature mesquite tree. It doesn't necessarily mean it needs an excessively higher amount of water. It just means it's going to typically, as a rule of thumb, larger plants are going to need some more water. microclimate. So if you think about your own home and you think about, okay, we have one area that is on the north side that doesn't get as much sun, or on the east side it only gets morning sun, then the water from the soil and from the plant leaves is not going to be evaporating at the same rate as it is on the west side or on the south facing side of your home. Maintenance practices, which we will go into later on. So this is the book I'd encourage you to reference for all of the great juicy details of watering. We'll go into some of those now. This is the book that you received in the email. The digital publication, you can also get a hard copy of this, which is really nice because you kind of flip through and gives you some good information. So I'll be referencing this. You'll notice some page numbers on my slides, and those are referencing the page number within this publication. That's the link for it. Okay, how often to run? That's kind of the biggest question. So we'll talk about, how long we want to run, but one thing I want you to notice about this graph is the difference between winter and summer. Look how big a gap that is. So we don't want to water the same all year round, because either we're going to be severely underwatering in the summer, or we're going to be severely overwatering in the winter if no changes are made. You'll see this most often on brand new homes. If you say, oh, we just moved into the home, it's been 2 years, I've never looked at the irrigation program. That's a very common thing. It's not something you would necessarily think of, but the program they put in is going to be the same whatever it was when those plants were planted. So that's going to be a really key thing to look at. Okay, how deep to run? So we want to run really deep based on the size of the plant. Typically, most areas in the valley, unless you're maybe near a riverbed, is you're going to have a kind of a clay soil, which we'll look at later on too, clay loam. So that means that you want to water really deeply and then give some time off. So what does deeply mean? Well, it depends on the plant that you're watering. So the larger plants are going to have deeper roots. Of course, the smaller plants have a little bit shallower roots. So it's going to impact overall your watering practices. And then here's that graphic I was mentioning about the soil type. So the one on the right is typically the one that we have. So one thing that's going to happen if you have been out there and watered or watched your drip system, not necessarily watching the drip system, it's like watching the grass grow, but if you notice when it's on your drip system and you see when the water hits the soil, what does it do first? It doesn't just go right through, right? Most of the time, it kind of sits there a little bit and puddles maybe even, especially if you have a higher flow. So what happens in clay soil is the water is going to go sideways typically first, and then over time it's going to slowly infiltrate down. So that's when we talk about we want to water really deeply. You kind of have to really soak an area a lot so that it kind of really gets a lot of water in that area, and then just give it that time to go down. So how much time? How often do I need to do that? I'm going to soak really deep, but then what? So water deeply. So for sprinklers, that typically means more minutes overall. You might notice you can't water a ton of minutes all at once because you get runoff. That's when you want to break those up into smaller chunks, but still water overall really deep if you're watering lawn with sprinklers. For drip, it typically is going to translate more into hours because our drip irrigation is labeled in gallons per hour. And so if we're trying to get gallons down for a plant, then we need to typically water X number of hours to get those gallons down. Sounds like a lot, but drip is very slow output, or it should be slow output. So when we talk about getting really deep watering, we're kind of getting into a little bit of math here, but it is important. One thing I want you to notice is that if we're talking about, okay, how much water we're trying to get down, if you have a shrub that's a certain size, then what you're aiming for is a certain number of gallons based on that shrub. So before deciding how many hours do I need to run, how many minutes do I need to run, you want to know how much water you're getting down in the first place. So you can do that a couple different ways. One of the easiest ways is just look at your drip emitters and see what their gallons per hour marking is on there. Maybe if it's not perfect, depending on the hardware, which we'll talk about the hardware, but even if it's not perfect, it's going to get you a ballpark. So think about the plants that you have, think about the trees that you have. Now on the trees, you can see some of those numbers on the right start to get a little excessive. If you have a desert tree, they don't need quite that many gallons down. But if you have something like a citrus plant, a citrus tree, or a fruit tree of some kind, then you probably are going to want to aim for those higher number of gallons because you're essentially using it for production. And to get that good juicy fruit, you're going to have to give it that extra water. So, but for your desert trees, typically you don't have to go much past that 10-foot gallon. So let's talk about the hardware. We said, well, we want to know how much water is going out there. So look at your drip emitters, kind of get a sense of how much water they're putting out. So here's an example of that. This is just, the brand itself is not as critical as the actual flow rates that we're looking at. That GPH is typically going to be standing for gallons per hour. Some of them are color coded. Unfortunately, they're not all color coded the same. So a red in one brand is not going to be the same output as a red in another brand. The best thing to do is look at it. You might need a microscope on some of them because it's printed so small. You might see it installed this way. You might see it installed at the end of the line as well. Typically, they're going to be in the range. The ones we see here are going to be in that 1 to 4 gallons per hour. They're going to be a pretty low output overall. So the main thing you want to look for when we talk about hardware, I won't go into all the irrigation specifics in this class, but there is an important point to make, and you want to look for what's called pressure compensating label. That's both on your sprinkler heads and on your drip emitters. And that's going to provide the optimal results. And that's because when you have a system that's watering, there's a certain amount of pressure that causes water to come out at the end of each of those lines. And if you have, let's say, the cheaper drip emitters, then you really have no idea. It's just going to be however much water is barreling down at that point is coming out. So if you have a long run of a drip line, then the plants at the end of the line are going to get less water than the plants at the beginning of the line because there's no pressure compensation. The drip emitters are not compensating for that at all. So unless you have ones that say pressure compensating. Oftentimes, the very common ones that we'll see are like these kinds. So if you're looking at these and you're like, oh yeah, those are the ones that we have. Those aren't the ones that you want to have. So these are the kind of drip emitters that typically, as you can see even from the picture, they're really just kind of putting out, they're just a hole basically, they have water coming out of it. It's not really regulating, it's not really compensating for any differences in pressure in that line. So you're going to have a very various, and if you have that one on the left, you probably already experienced this where you go out there every day and you're like, I just adjusted it yesterday, now it's doing something different. That's because it's not pressure compensating. So it's hard to maintain the system. I would not consider these as part of a desert hardy landscape or a resilient landscape. This is going to be kind of a high maintenance, cause you some issues. It'll waste a little more water. Okay, where are your drip emitters placed? This is a key for the plants and for the system. You want to have them at the edge of the drip line of the plants. So that's on your shrubs and your trees. So that's going to be typically, if you're looking at a tree above you, if there's leaves above you, then you might want to go out just a little bit further to the edge of those leaves. And that's where the plants are taking up most of the water. Those roots that take up the water are typically on the outside. And think about it logically, when it rains, like we've been having, where does the water fall first? You have these droplets hitting the leaves, they kind of go to the outside of the plant and land on the outside around the roots, around the canopy. So if a lot of times you'll see those drip emitters right near the middle of the trunk, and that's not really where trees and shrubs take water up. Those roots are more structural. So you want to, if you have that situation, you want to move your drip emitters further out. And that's going to be much better for your plants, going to keep them healthier, reduce the instance of rot, and it's going to make more water efficient over time as well, because you're actually soaking the area where the plants need the water. So again, we don't have time to go into all the details of how to program and everything. So it's kind of a brief overview, but I would encourage you to check out the Programming Your Irrigation Controller video that Glendale has on their Green Living series. So go ahead and check that out online, and it'll give you more details about how to put in the information we just reviewed into the actual controller. Kind of referencing along the same lines, we've talked about we want to water really deeply. We want to get a certain number of gallons down. So then the question is, how often do I need to do that? And that we talked about the seasons. So this is kind of just a brief kind of overview of what those seasons, how much that impacts it. So you can see if you have trees and shrubs in the summertime, they might only need water about once a week in a really tough landscape. Okay, how often do we need to run? This piece right here is kind of the, if you will, more complicated version of the previous slide, but it has all the different kinds of plants that you might find out there. And it's basically, you're talking about frequency. So on your controller, you'll have a setting on there. It's a little hidden sometimes, but you can water every X number of days. And so basically, if you are focusing, let's hone in on one of these. So if you have a desert adapted shrub, which is kind of the ones we've been talking about, you want to water once every 7 to 21 days. So that's a pretty wide range, right? Either once a week or once every 3 weeks. So how do we know? Well, it depends on if you have a really mature established plant, it's really tough. Or do you have one that's maybe a little bit new or a little bit more on the sensitive side, but it's still considered desert adapted? Then you might decide to water it once a week. So once we know we're watering really deeply, then the only thing you really need to adjust throughout the year is how often you're watering. If we don't adjust that and we're watering very frequently or too frequently, you might encounter this situation. So sometimes you'll see this out there after a storm, sometimes not even after a storm. Sometimes you see these plants just topple over seemingly for no reason. And a lot of times there are several reasons for this, but one of the reasons can be if it was watered too heavily or too frequently. So those roots were really not growing to a depth that was appropriate to support the structure of the tree. So if it was watered too frequently, number one, that soil was too soggy, the roots were starting to rot, and then the roots really didn't have a chance to grow outside of that zone. And so we have to remember that the roots also need oxygen. And so if we have the soil too wet for too long, then that compromises the plant because it doesn't have oxygen. So you can see these situations kind of anywhere, and a lot of times it can be due to too frequent of watering. So what about high water use plants? If you're thinking, okay, well, I have a nice big ficus tree, I still want to have a pretty hardy landscape, I'm not going to rip it out, and that's fair. That's not something you necessarily want to do. It provides a lot of value. You could still have a high water use plant and keep your yard as hardy as possible. And one of the biggest, most important ways to do that is to reference this chart again. So this is also available online, but you can see it's on page 18, which if you have the book in your hand, I think it's at the very end, it's one of the last pages. But you'll notice on there's a line for high water use plants. So we're right now we're still in summer, we're getting to the end of summer. You can see I just highlighted on here, if we happen to be in fall and you had, let's say, a hibiscus plant, but it was established, you might still only need to water it about once a week. You consider, wow, that's, for a plant that's maybe considered a higher water use plant, if it's established and it's got good root depth, you could still have it be water efficient and be pretty hardy. So if you have a situation where you are looking at your irrigation, your program, and you're thinking about how it's been watered in the past, and you say, well, I've probably been watering maybe more frequently than I needed to, or maybe I should have, or maybe I inherited a irrigation schedule that's inappropriate. What can I do? Well, I like to call it training. You basically just kind of helping the plants to get trained up a little bit. You wanted to help get their roots to grow deeper. So you say, okay, well, it's been watered every day for who knows how long. So I can't go to once a week right now. So what I would recommend is starting with a shorter frequency, and say, okay, well, let's start by watering once every 4 to 5 days. Do that for a little bit of time, maybe a month or so, and then see how the plants are doing. And if they still look fine, then say, all right, well, now we're going to transition to a little bit longer, once every week or so, or whatever the recommendation is for that specific plant. So you might have to do a little bit of work and going out there and setting some alarms for yourself once every month or two. But it is possible to do this over a growing season or a couple growing seasons. And it can really help to get a plant that maybe wasn't originally going to be resilient to be more hardy. And then at the end of the day, you want to end at your kind of maximum frequency if you want to have a really tough landscape that is really hardy, then you want to kind of probably push them out to that further extent and say, okay, I'm going to water once every 3 weeks and just kind of take a look at it. If you have a situation like last summer where we had really hot, really dry, then you might need to water a little bit more frequently. If you said we normally water once every 3 weeks, but we've had no rain and it's been really extra hot, let's water once every 2 weeks. But that's a huge difference. It's still pretty water efficient considering if you previously were watering once every day or once every couple of days or 3 times a week. Then if you say the difference between watering twice a month or 3 times a month, it's still going to be a pretty resilient landscape, and it's still going to be pretty water efficient overall. So for maximum resilience, one thing you can consider, or maybe you already have the situation in your yard, is turn off the automatic irrigation and just hand water as needed. So there's a couple of ways you can do this. If you plant some plants that are really tough, some of them, especially cacti and succulents, it's often recommended, well, more cacti than succulents, but for cacti especially, it's often recommended to not water them with an irrigation system because they are more prone to rot. So it's actually better to just turn that off completely once they're established. Now, you might say this summer have been perfect for them because we had enough rain that really you could have had your irrigation off since, July 4th almost. But last summer, that wouldn't have been the case. You probably wouldn't want to go out there and hand water or do a deep soak. So you can do that a couple of ways, either with a hose if you only have a couple plants. But if you have a really large mature tree and you're trying to do that, one thing I'd recommend is maybe getting like a soaker hose, plugging it in, watering it overnight, give it a deep soak, and then put it back in your garage or whatever for another 3 to 4 weeks, and just keep an eye on those plants. But that is one way you can do that to kind of have maximum resiliency for your landscape, where you say, I really don't need to irrigate almost hardly ever unless we have some extremes in weather, and that is possible to do. I don't have the picture here, but there is some interesting inadvertent studies that have been done, especially us from the working in the water utility side, where we know which commercial landscapes, like businesses, haven't been watered for maybe years, and yet they still have plants out there, because we can see the water use data. And so say, well, they haven't turned that meter on for maybe 3 or 4 years, and yet if you drive by, there's still plants and trees out there. How is that possible? It's possible because they're just living off the rainfall. So you can do the same thing at your own home. And you don't have to let it go that extreme because you might only have a couple species left, but you can certainly do it with most of the species that are desert adapted. Okay, if you have plants that didn't make it, like we talked about before, if you have those plants that are marginal, replace it with some tougher plants. And that will get over time, you eventually will have a landscape or a yard that's going to have a really high resilience, can be very hardy, because if a plant didn't make it, you say, well, that one's not going back in, I'm trying something else. And you're going to have a better opportunity to experiment and find some plants that are going to be your toughest ones. And then we talked about this, training some plants for deeper roots. Have a plant that you don't want to lose necessarily or tear out, but you do want to not have to water it so much or maintain it so much. Try training, giving it some deeper roots. Okay, that was a long section. These other 3 are not that long, so don't worry. Maintenance practices. Before I move on to this, are there any questions?
Hey, Andrew, we're good right now. I don't have any questions in the chat right now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And we can always talk some more at the end if there are more questions related to this. So, okay, excellent. So let's talk about maintenance. Maintenance is a big part of a desert hardy landscape. And this is kind of talking about some things you don't want to do. Pruning is a big thing. You might have watched a class or attended a class on pruning. So oftentimes around our area, you'll see a lot of improper pruning practices. So I like to joke around and we call it shear it and clear it, or hack it and pack it. And that's when you see situations like this. And you have these plants that are trimmed into some boxes, or they're just kind of relentlessly maintained. And it's kind of funny because you'll go by and it's so hot outside, and you see those poor landscape crews out there working so hard. They don't have to. They're working harder than they need to. They're out there trimming these poor plants so hard. They don't even need to. The plants don't want it. The landscapers don't want to be out there. It's hot. And it actually damages the plant over time. It increases the water need because every time that plant is stressed from a cut, it needs to produce more leaves, and it causes stress, and it causes some additional water need for that plant as it's trying to get back into growth mode. And eventually it shortens the life of the plant, and it could cause kind of a lot of that hollowing out that you're seeing on the left side, where eventually you just have some sticks left. And you say, okay, well, tear it out and put another one in. It's like, okay, well, then that's not a hardy landscape either. So you might see this a lot, or it happens inadvertently because the plant was not in the right spot. And so it keeps getting in the way. And so it keeps getting trimmed relentlessly for that. Something to keep in mind that kind of goes back to that landscaping with style book or design. You want to pick the plant that fits in the right spot. So take a look at the size of the plant. So we talk a lot about water use, but when you're selecting your plant that you want to put somewhere, also look to see how big it's going to get. And if it seems like you're like, oh, wow, that seems really big, you're like, yeah, it's okay, I'll just trim it. Then you're probably going to cause yourself more headache than you need. This is also a common thing that we'll see here. This is one of those plants that without this kind of trimming would be covered in blooms. And if you look really closely, I think it's somewhere on that first plant. There's a one tiny little bloom. So you can see the landscaper didn't do quite a thorough job because there's still one bloom left. But this was actually during the bloom season of this plant, but you would never know because they're, they're just trimmed up quite excessively. So if you're really kind of craving some cupcakes, just don't call your landscaper, but they will deliver them. This situation too, a lot of times, like we talked about, it's like, oh, the plant was too large. I just had to cut it. And you can see this poor thing hardly has anything left. It's just kind of death by 1,000 cuts, I guess, if you will. But something to keep in mind is that it's not going to be an element of a very resilient landscape, because it's going to be a lot of maintenance, and then it's also eventually going to make that plant either cause it to use more water, or it's eventually just going to cause it to die. This is one I like to call dancing twigs estates. So if you have, this is a Palo Verde tree, but it's kind of hard to tell. You don't want to have your plants trimmed like this, your trees especially. This really kind of shortens their lifespan. Is if you have plants that are really giving you problems because of their size, there are some strategies if you contact a certified arborist to help maybe with some thinning. If you do have to do some major cuts, there are some ways that you can do that, but it's not recommended as a regular maintenance practice. It's not an element of a hardy landscape. So when do you need to prune then? Because we know that sometimes it has to happen. Well, typically you'll hear if the branches are dead or dying, or they're sick, then you want to go ahead and trim those. That's a good idea to do. If you have frost damage on some of your maybe more sensitive plants, even if they are still desert adapted, but they're just a little more sensitive, we have a cold year, then if you wait to trim that frost damage, a lot of times the stems underneath where it looks brown and dead are actually still alive. And also what it's doing, as we'll see in the next picture, it's protecting the plant, the other parts of the plant, from more frost damage. I'll show you a picture of that here in a sec. Selective pruning for form. So if you do need to, especially young plants, that's the right time to kind of prune them, especially for trees, to prune them at that time so that the tree grows into the shape and size that you want it, with the right branching and structural habits, so that it is a success later on. Right plant, right place. We talked about that in the design side. So especially if you're replacing some plants, take a look at how big they're going to get and make sure it's going to work in that spot you're thinking of. So this is a lantana that got damaged from some frost. You can see that some of it's still alive, so the plant's clearly still alive. So the tempting thing might be, as soon as you see it, it's like, all right, I gotta trim that off and cut all the ugly branches. But keep in mind that, number one, some of those might still be alive, so that as soon as it warms up, they're gonna have some new growth on it. But number two, it's also protecting the plant from further frost damage. So if you cut it all the way down, now you have some fresh cuts. Those are now the sensitive parts of the plants. And then if we have another frost, that gets damaged, and it might even kill the plant that time. So if you can hold off just a little bit and until the end of the last frost, and then kind of clean it up and see what happens, that's typically a better recommendation for a resilient landscape. Okay, grading practices. I'm going to go ahead and go through these last sections, and then we'll address any other questions at the end, since we're getting close to our time here. Grading practices. So grading, don't think of like school or your tests. This is more about kind of using the natural curvature of the land, or even the unnatural. You can create your own curvature of the land in your yard to harvest some of that rainwater. So you can maximize, especially like this last rain that we've had. We've had a couple of nice rains this summer where some of them were downpours, but some of them were actually just kind of rainfall, right? So that's really nice, and that's really nice for the plants, and it's easier for the soil to take up because it's not just hitting it all at once. It's kind of just slowly feeding it in. But even if we have one of those more traditional monsoons that is like a dump of water, then if you have a landscape that can collect that, something like this, at least a portion of it, then it can kind of sit in there. You'll see this a lot of times in those retention basins that are around town. That water can then soak into the soil in your yard rather than down on the street or somewhere else. And then those tree roots, remember what we talked about, where the roots that take up water are for these trees and shrubs? they are outside. So a lot of times on a mature plant, they're even further past the canopy. So where that water's collecting around that tree, those roots are going to be able to take that up. And maybe where you might have normally had to irrigate that tree in a summer like this, you'd say, look, we didn't have to irrigate that tree at all. And it still got plenty of water because we captured it when the rain fell. This is another example of that, maybe even a little bit more low maintenance, but you're still capturing some of that rainfall. Again, those roots of those plants are going to be somewhat extensive into the soil. And then keep in mind, a lot of times the soil that we have is that clay or clay loam soil. So it's not like the water sits there and then goes down only. It's going to be going sideways. And so just because your plant isn't sitting right there in the basin, you don't have to have any plants in the basin if you don't want. They're still going to be benefiting from the water that's moving through that soil. So if you have some smart grading practices in your yard, you can further reduce your water use. The plants are going to love the rainwater, and you're going to have a yard that's super resilient, and you're not going to have to do so much for it. So the last thing we'll talk about is sharing your success. So what we mean by that is talking about the things that you've tried in your yard and experimented with, and sharing that with the people in your community. So a huge reason for this, and this is more obvious now than ever, is because, like we always say, we rise and fall together. So this is just the most recent screenshot I captured of the water levels in Lake Mead. And you know, our as cities here, we kind of know this is coming, and so we prepare for this. However, you know, the more water that we all save collectively, then the better it is for us overall, you know, because now it's less water that we use. So that's more water that we store. It's kind of as simple as that. And so if we are all doing things together that are successful, and we're all maintaining landscapes that are really highly resilient, then that gives us a way better opportunity to weather these types of situations. We all are in this as a community in terms of, and we all share the same water sources. So it's important that we share the things that have worked well for us with each other. So it's just kind of an example of a house that is going to be a really pretty hardy, low maintenance. And you can see some of the things we talked about. There's some different textures over there. There's a little bit of color. And this is a landscape that they almost have to do nothing for almost all year. You might have to go out there maybe twice a year, maybe trim a little bit, and that's going to be it. They might not even have to add any water. So something to kind of keep in mind if you're looking for a landscape that has really high levels of resiliency, can be nice. If you see that and you're like, that looks really exposed, I would agree. It is really exposed and kind of probably hot right there. So there are other landscapes you can have. So oftentimes our succulents and even cacti, you might notice if you do hiking and stuff, or explore some of the native areas, that cacti will start out by growing under the protection of another plant. Sometimes we call that a host plant, or like a tree of some kind. And so having shade doesn't disqualify having other plants that like sun. Sometimes they actually can kind of get adapted that way. So this is another landscape, pretty resilient. There's not really much maintenance that needs to happen here, except maybe some tree trimming once in a while. You can see it looks like the house is for sale. So hey, if you're interested. This is another one, a little bit of a mix. So you could say, okay, these are all tough plants. They're very hardy. They probably don't have to apply hardly any water to this, except maybe some deep soaks on the trees once in a while. But one thing you can kind of probably notice off the bat is how those trees, when they were first planted, it was probably perfect, or maybe that first 10 years. But now after 15, 20 years, those trees are running into each other a little bit. So not the end of the world, a little more maintenance is needed. Maybe than before. You kind of see how the trees have kind of grown away from each other to maximize their sun exposure. But the result underneath, as you can see, there's a lot of canopy coverage, and that's a really shady front yard, which is pretty nice if you're thinking of just maybe want to sit out there or something like that, or reduce some energy use at your home. So some things to keep in mind, and sharing things that you've tried and that have worked for you is really important. So how do we do that? Some of these are pretty obvious. You talk with your neighbors within your community. If you use social media, then that's a great way to kind of put some pictures, and especially if people are saying, oh, what kind of plant is that? And you know what it is, or you didn't know, but then you looked at our book, the landscape plants book, and you figured out what it was. Then other people can find that same plant and then plant it themselves. That's a great way to share that. if you're really interested in landscaping and helping other people and kind of becoming an expert, I'd recommend checking out the Maricopa County Master Gardener programs through the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. And that is what I have today. So thank you everybody for attending, and I'll open it up for questions and turn it over to you, Omane, for facilitating that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew, for a wonderful presentation. When you were showing the poor pruning practices, I felt like I was like watching a horror movie that was just never ending, a slide after slide of terrible pruning. I was like, oh my gosh, it just never ends. So
Oh, yeah, it feels like that sometimes when we're out and about, right?
yes, it's like, oh no, this way, this way. But yeah, we had a question that came through. So someone asked, can you get an HOA to back off on pruning requirements? If plants don't look like the sheared ones that we've seen, they still get a violation notice. And so Joanne took a stab at it too, and we just wanted to get your thoughts. But Joanne had said that she would approach this by trying to educate the HOA board, especially the landscape maintenance subcommittee, about best landscaping practices. But what would you take? Probably something similar, I would assume.
Yeah, that's a great answer from Joanne. I think it's sometimes I've heard of people who can kind of get away with it once the plant blooms, and people are like, wow, that looks really nice. It's like, yeah, because I didn't trim it. And so if you can get to that point without getting a violation, I mean, that would be maybe kind of the sneaky way to do it. And then until the plant gets to a point where it's blooming, and then people are like, wow, that's actually really nice. And then it's kind of, if you can snap some pictures of your yard like that, and then use that as, if you will, evidence to kind of say, hey, here's the reason why I'm letting the plant grow a little bit, then that gives you a little bit more leverage. Yeah, from the science side, or like from the kind of the legal side going through, yeah, you'd want to talk with your board and the landscape committee, because if that's really the look that they're going for, there's not that many plants that grow well here that can handle that kind of pruning. So it's really hard to keep a landscape in that kind of shape. It just means you're going to have to replace plants a lot more frequently, or they're going to have plants die more frequently. And then it's like, well, so I think in a way, it would help them, because they're going to have less chasing of their own tail, because then they're going to be giving people violations because they're missing plants and trees. Like, well, they're missing because they die because we over pruned them. So yeah, to try and stop that cycle, a way would be, yeah, you probably want to talk with your board if you can, but if you can show them some examples of what a good landscape looks like and a healthy desert landscape looks like, then, especially if they're that hung up on a visual look, showing them an alternative visual look, they might actually glom onto that rather than just trying to explain it in words, which can be really challenging to do. And the landscape maintenance companies, a lot of times we found they know what the right practice is. Even sometimes depending on if you have one for your home, but the common area landscape companies, those really big companies, a lot of times they know, they're just doing what they're told. So there's a difference there. So it is good to try and get in and have that discussion for sure. So yeah, I would echo what Joanne said. I guess the only other thing I would add on is taking pictures of your yard, or you can try your backyard. Let your backyard kind of do what you want it to do. Take a picture of that and say, hey, here's the difference between, and then hold up the pictures side by side. Here's a backyard and here's our front yards of all these homes in this neighborhood. So which one would you guys rather have? And if they still say we want the other one, it's kind of like, okay, then you got to run for the board, I guess.
Great question. A picture is worth 1,000 words, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we had another question come through, and they asked, do you have a list of plants that do well in the desert? I like the ones with flowers, and thank you for the presentation.
Absolutely. So that's a question that they're asking, if there's a list of plants. Yeah, I would recommend looking at that publication, the landscape plants for the Arizona desert. That's that pink book. You can find it online as well, amwa.org/plants. I'll go ahead and go back to that slide here just so you can see the link. This is a good place to start. If you're looking for like your toughest of the tough plants, I believe within this book there is I think they have a category in there that's like, these are like your super low water or super low maintenance, and those are going to be your really tough plants. If you go to a garden center or nursery, more of a classic one that really knows their plants and they sell more exclusively desert plants, they're going to be able to tell you too which ones they see out there that are really successful. So there are, you can whittle it down to a short list of plants that can take a lot of abuse and really still make it. But I would encourage you to check this out, and that way you can pick out the plants that you will like. Otherwise, the ones that I've seen, I would say that are like the super low maintenance. A lot of times you'll see like our like winter visitors or snowbirds who will use a landscape like this. It's going to be mostly cacti. And so if you have almost all cacti and then maybe like one really tough tree like a mesquite, then those are the kind of landscapes that if you walked away from several months and came back, they're going to be really slow growing, really low water. I mean, mesquite won't be slow growing, but you could find some trees and plants that are going to be really slow growing and really low water and almost no trimming. And those are going to be the toughest, landscapes out there. So with extreme weather, that has an opportunity that some plants can still die, but I was impressed. There are a lot of plants that made it through last year as hot and dry as it was. So so one way you can kind of poke around if you're interested in that I'd recommend, if you don't mind being kind of an explorer, is just going around the city and seeing which landscapes look like they're maybe haven't been maintained or haven't been cared for, if you will, in a while. And whether that's a home or like a shopping center, and see what those plants are. And those are going to be your toughest of the tough plants because they've been neglected. So yeah, it's a good question. Another one I'll just throw out there, you have like the Texas sage is always a really tough one. Bougainvillea, sometimes it gets a bad rap, but those do best when they're ignored. So that's one that you can kind of just plant and almost, once it's established, kind of walk away from it, and it's going to be kind of always there. So those are just a couple ones, but yeah, this book is good for that too.
Thank you, Andrew. We have another question that came through. They said, hi, do you have a list of nurseries other than Home Depot and Lowe's? Oh, it looks like Joanne's answering that one. So I'll let Joanne answer that one. We'll move on to Betty Fields. She says, does the tree branches with leaves protect the trunk of a tree?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so sometimes you'll see, especially on the pruning side, let me go ahead and get to a picture that has that. When you talk about pruning, one of the reasons why you don't want to prune too excessively is because when you have, hopefully I'm not making anybody dizzy here. I think I had a picture that I wanted to, okay, yeah, so even this one. So yeah, if you prune too much on this tree and thinned it out too much or cut huge chunks of it, actually this other one, let me just go to it here, this one. So this one is going to die before that, but you can even see now is some of that trunk has been sunburned, and that's because they cut out too much of the leaves that were shading the trunk. And you might notice this on some older mature Palo Verdes as well that might seem normally healthy, and they probably are healthy, but they kind of have a little bit more of a calloused trunk on the lower part. And that's because typically the way we maintain trees in the urban landscape is we'll want them to be more tree. So we kind of have the leaves collected up at the top, and then the trunk down below is kind of more exposed. And so that can get sunburned, especially on a Palo Verde, because the trunk is green. So it is using the trunk as part of photosynthesis, as part of its adaptation to the desert, if it needs to lose its leaves for drought. But the downside of that is if we trim it like a tree and then that trunk is exposed for too long, then it can get sunburned. Now, Palo Verdes can usually handle that a bit. But if you ever look out in the wild or take some hikes in the hills, you'll notice that naturally they're going to be more of like just a giant shrub. So they're protecting all of their branches by all the way that they kind of grow a little crazy. And it's like, that's not the plant we want to have in our landscape, because we want it to be neat and clean. But the benefit of why those plants do that is because it's constantly protecting all of its sensitive parts of the trunk from the sun exposure. So yeah, that's a good point. And one way to kind of try and keep that is if you hire a certified arborist to do the tree trimming and kind of express your concern, that is something that they will take into consideration. And that's a reason why you don't want to prune excessively, because taking out too much of that leaf cover will cause damage to those branches. Doesn't mean it's going to kill the tree necessarily. It's rare that you'll see a tree die from a sunburn, but I have seen it on like citrus trees. Those are the ones that you'll usually see. Sometimes you'll see them paint the trunks. That's a reason why. Yeah, that's a great point. And it does kind of go back to pruning and maintenance. There's a little bit of a balance because of the way we want to maintain trees in our urban landscape. We want them to have a certain kind of form. And certain trees are much tougher for that. most of the other trees, like a mesquite, you know, you're not going to see that kind of sunburn damage as much, if at all. Their trunks are a little bit more built for that. So if you are concerned about that, then you can pick a tree that's less susceptible to that. Yeah, good question.
Thank you, Andrew, for all these great answers. We have a lot of great comments. People are saying thank you, great presentation, enjoyed the class, thank you, thanks, nice class, love the presentation style, thank you very much. So I don't see any other questions, but I'll do some closing remarks, and if any questions pop in through, we still have some time. But just some closing remarks is that our next class in our Green Living series is Landscaping for Small Spaces. So this class will also be held via Zoom on Wednesday, September 15th, and it'll be at the same time from 5:30 to 7 p.m. And for those who might have joined us later in the presentation, you will all receive a follow-up email with the PowerPoint, the recording, and a link to the survey. And again, if you complete the survey by Monday, you'll be entered in for a chance to win a free gift card from a local nursery. So again, we definitely value your feedback. Please fill out that survey if you have the time. And let's see if any questions have popped through, but those were my closing remarks. I think Joanna's just continuing helping with the chat about some nurseries, and all of the chat resources and information shared in the chat will also be included in the follow-up email. So if you weren't able to grab some of the links in the chat, don't worry, we'll include that. Oh, we have a question that came through from Charles. He asked, what are good beginner plants?
That's a good question. Yeah, kind of similar to that one we talked about before with you want some plants that you can more or less guarantee success. Yeah, there's a good amount of options out there. The ones that like I always kind of go back to that Texas Ranger is a good one, or sometimes you'll hear it called Texas Sage. A leucophyllum is the scientific name. Bougainvillea. I just saw somebody put lantana is one. If you want some color, lantana is good. They tend to be lantana are more sensitive in areas that are close to hardscape because they can be more sensitive to reflected heat. But that's also a good one if you have a nice spot for it, or if you're looking to put one in a pot. A lot of cacti can be, I would say, not necessarily succulents. If you've tried succulents and not had success, the reason is a lot of times because succulents, like the smaller ones maybe that you'll find that are like, oh wow, that's really cool looking, because they need a little bit higher humidity than we typically have here. So they do really well in places like coastal California because it's really dry, sometimes even drier there than it is here, but they have higher humidity from the coast. So we don't really have that here, and so sometimes they can't make it. So that's when I would lean more towards like a cacti, like a what's the scientific name? I call it the nopales. That's the the ones, the opuntia plant, or the prickly pear. Prickly pear, that one's super tough. That one is a fun one to try, and it'll kind of take over a little bit if you let it. Mesquite tree is usually very hardy. It can grow a little wild, but as a hardy plant, and if you want some really quick shade, that's a nice tough one. That's pretty easy to get going. It's funny, in my neighborhood, I've noticed some people have tried, they have like one plant they planted in their front, and they tried like a yucca. It's like, oh, that's really cool. It didn't make it. Then they tried like another, like a ficus tree, and it didn't make it. And they finally just put a mesquite tree in it, and it did fine. So they just like gave up, and they're like, all right, fine, I'll just do this one because that's the one they are like, yeah, I know it's gonna make it. So it sometimes comes down to your yard too, and what's gonna do well in your yard, and what else is going on. If you have a lot of exposure in hardscape, somebody put euphorbias in there. That's a good one. They can be. Those have been pretty good as well. They can also be sensitive to hardscaped areas. So one thing to keep in mind, if you have a hot wall that gets a lot of heat coming off of it, that's an area where you might have some more challenges at finding a plant that's going to make it. Yellow bells is also a good one, or orange bells. Bougainvillea, I always say, is a good one as well. So yeah, I'm sure some people have some great recommendations. The master gardeners can also be a good resource for that. If you're saying, hey, I'm just starting out, I'm new to the desert, and I kind of need a little guidance on something, I'd recommend reaching out to them. And then of course, Joanne, Omine, and Anne at Glendale, they're excellent. You guys are really great at plants. And so I would definitely refer you to them as well for some more tips.
Awesome. I love the discussion. Thanks everyone for sharing their recommendations in the chat. Definitely adds to the discussion. So thank you. With that, I don't see any other questions that have come through. So I think we are good to close for the evening, but if you think of any follow-up questions, you all know who to reach out to. We are accessible. Feel free to reach out to us, especially at the greenliving@glendaleaz.com email. If you have any questions or pictures that you'd like to share, just let us know. But I think with that, we're going to close for the evening, and we appreciate you all for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you at the next class.